Ozzy Osbourne is a very interesting person. He has genes that make him 6 times more likely to become hooked to drugs and alcohol than the ordinary individual. Ozzy Osbourne has died recently, and since then, people all around the world have been asking the same question. How did he survive for so long? How could a man who spent decades drowning his body in drugs, drink, and mayhem stay working when most people would have given up years ago? Researchers ultimately sequenced the Prince of Darkness's DNA years before he died. They didn't think they would uncover anything unusual. Instead, the results shocked geneticists and showed biological abnormalities that specialists still can't explain. "This is impossible," one researcher famously said. This remark has now become the ideal title for his last chapter, because Ozzy's genome held clues to his strength, his addictions, his vitality, and even pieces of his ancient ancestry that made him different from most modern people. Researchers found something in Ozzy Osbourne's DNA that shows who he really is, and it's not what everybody thought. The Dark Prince comes into the lab. Nobody knew what Ozzy Osbourne's blood would show when it got to the lab. The scientists at Cofactor Genomics felt they were doing a normal sequencing job until the data started showing strange things that they couldn't explain. The algorithm found one mutation after another, weird gene variants that weren't in any other human database. One researcher was said to have leaned back in surprise and said, "This can't be right." Another researcher did the test again. The same thing happened again. Ozzy's DNA didn't act like everyone else's. The sequences that had to do with metabolism, dopamine control, and nerve communication showed changes that are quite rare in normal people. It was an insane discovery that made scientists stop and ponder about what the human body could do. His genome seemed like it had been made for extremes, made to handle poisons that would kill most people, to rewire itself when chemicals attack it, and to survive punishment that should end a life. That was bad enough. But the second finding was more stranger. Researchers found pieces of old DNA buried inside his chromosomes when they looked into areas of his family tree. There were clear indicators of Neanderthal ancestry in a limited area on chromosome 10. The crew thought it was almost impossible. It's not a symbol or a metaphor. It's a true genetic signature. Modern genomics says that Ozzy Osbourne had a genetic code that connected him directly to a species of early humans that is now extinct. The group checked again. There was no mistake with contamination. The data stayed, and all of a sudden, the thought that this man who had survived overdoses, crashes that almost killed him, and decades of non-stop touring might have inherited something old and primitive didn't seem so crazy anymore. The news spread swiftly among scientists. Geneticists suggested that Ozzy might be a new branch of the human tree, with some parts being modern Homo sapiens and others being rock and roll Neanderthals. But there was real interest behind the jokes. His DNA was not merely an object of interest. It showed how the body changes, adapts, and sometimes breaks the rules of biology. What else was hidden in those code spirals that were all twisted? Why did drugs and alcohol affect his brain's chemistry in various ways? Could the same genes that enabled ancient people endure a harsh planet also explain how one man made it through his own chaos? The tiny patterns held answers that would make the story of Ozzy Osbourne much stranger and more human than anyone had thought. The genomic torture test that is in Ozzy's code. Cofactor Genomics and Genome Inc. had a straightforward purpose when they decided to sequence Ozzy Osbourne's whole DNA. Find out if years of living on the edge has left a mark on your genes. This kind of testing had been done on celebrities before, but this time it was different. Ozzy's case was about being curious about science. How had this man lived through something that should have killed him many times over? A vial of blood was taken from Ozzy in July 2010 to start the process. While Genome, a company based in Cambridge, combed through the data, Cofactor Genomics did the sequencing. The results didn't make sense in a clinical setting. The scientists weren't looking at the genome of a rock singer who was 61 years old. It was like they were looking at a live contradiction. Ozzy's DNA had a number of uncommon variations, some of which had never been observed before. Some changed how his body processed drugs and alcohol, while others changed the neurological system and how dopamine levels were controlled. These changes weren't small either. They were really unusual, almost if his body had discovered unique ways to deal with decades of chemical warfare. A mutation that stood out happened in the ADH4 gene, which is important for breaking down alcohol. This changed how much of a certain enzyme his body made, which changed how he burned through alcohol. It wasn't painless, but it was faster and with less damage than other people. The CLTCL1 gene, which is linked to how nerve cells talk to each other, also had an unusual change. The variation Ozzy has a unique protein that could affect locomotion, impulse control, addiction, and even creativity. It looked like Ozzy's brain was set up for both genius and disorder, a system that is continually on the verge of being overloaded but is meant to be stimulating. He also had a different kind of dopamine signaling, which is the neurotransmitter that controls motivation, risky behavior, and reward. It elucidated why Ozzy, notwithstanding his age and extensive past of maltreatment, continued to display remarkable energy and originality. It also gave hints about why he had always been driven to drugs that made the dopamine reaction stronger. Scientists observed that numerous individuals with analogous variants often engage in risky, high-reward behaviors. That adrenaline led Ozzy to not only become addicted, but also to perform well, become famous, and have an unending desire to keep going. When the research team met with Ozzy to talk about the results, they discovered that he was quite interested. He wasn't looking for excuses for what he had done in the past. He wanted real answers. "There is no medical reason why I should still be alive after drinking so much alcohol." In a column for the Sunday Times, he wrote, "Maybe my DNA could tell me why. It did, to a startling extent." His genome demonstrated that it could handle stress on many levels. Genes that control cell repair and detoxification seemed to be working extra hard, which made it seem like his body would be better than most at fixing small damage before it became deadly. That doesn't imply he couldn't be hurt, but it did suggest that he had a biological efficiency that most people don't have. Still, there were some problems with the results. None of the scientists said that his DNA was the only thing that kept him alive. Luck, lifestyle, and the environment all had an effect. But it was clear that his genetic code had more than a few uncommon genetic advantages. The results also made me think of an uncomfortable question. If genes can affect addiction, inventiveness, or risk-taking, where does personal responsibility start and end? The researchers were unequivocal. They said that genetics might change the probabilities, but they don't decide what happens. Human willpower, experience, and environment are still much stronger forces. But even with that scientific care, Ozzy's DNA gave us a rare look at how genetics and personality are connected. The same molecular oddities that enabled him stay alive could also explain the things that made him who he was. The vitality that never ran out, the mood swings, and the magnetic pull that made him the Prince of Evil. What his DNA said about the boundaries of science itself was probably the most interesting thing of all. Even with thousands of data points, the experts couldn't find a single mutation that made Ozzy Osbourne who he was. There was no rockstar gene or variant that could explain his genius or his craziness. Instead, they found something complicated. A network of features, interconnections, and riddles that science is just starting to figure out. The more they investigated, the more the data seemed to suggest something even odd. A link between his genetic strength and his long family history. They would soon find out that the link ran back tens of thousands of years to a time when people weren't the only ones on Earth, and that news would startle both Ozzy and the scientific community. The Neanderthal in the glass. Researchers thought they would get a simple genetic map of European ancestry when they used Ozzy Osbourne's DNA to reconstruct his family tree. Instead, they found something deep in his genome that left them dumbfounded. There was a piece of genetic material on chromosome 10 that didn't belong to modern people at all. The Neanderthals owned it. The scientists felt it might be a mistake at first. Sometimes genome sequencing might lead to cross-contamination, and since Ozzy is such a well-known person, they needed to be sure. They looked over the raw data again. The order stayed the same. The markers were real. Ozzy Osbourne, one of the most ridiculous people in rock history, had the unmistakable genetic fingerprints of a long-dead species of early humans. In fact, a lot of people of European and Asian origin have modest amounts of Neanderthal DNA in their bodies, usually between 1 and 4%. But for Ozzy, the discovery seemed strangely right. A man who had lived through decades of harsh conditions had a real trace of primordial hardiness in his blood. One of the researchers remarked that Ozzy's body might still be using software from the Stone Age. That comment was made in jest, but it brought up an interesting scientific idea. Some Neanderthal genes are connected to features that affect how well people can handle pain, how quickly they burn calories, and how well their immune systems work. They were tools for survival for a species that had to deal with harsh winters, not enough food, and continual physical pain. Some of those genes are still working in people today, helping us fight infections or break down fat in a new way. Scientists thought that Ozzy's genes might have certain variations that helped Neanderthals live in very harsh settings in the past. Those similar versions could have helped Ozzy go through his own tough times in today's environment. It was a lyrical twist that the man who once seemed to be the embodiment of chaos would actually be the result of evolutionary endurance. The news went crazy with the tale, calling him a Neanderthal in leather or a caveman. Ozzy thought it was funny, as usual. He laughed when he was told he had a little Neanderthal in his genes and said, "That makes sense. I always knew I wasn't completely human, but there was something deep behind the amusement." The discovery connected ancient survival with modern strength. It hinted at how evolution gradually changes us, leaving bits of DNA from those who lived before us. Somehow, those pieces had found a stage in Ozzy's case. The relationship to Neanderthals has sparked interest in what makes people creative. Scientists have long argued over whether art, rhythm, and music are things that only humans do or if they have deeper evolutionary foundations. If Ozzy's genome contained remnants of an ancestral species, may some aspect of that ancient circuitry have shaped his musical instincts? It is a question that cannot be proven, but it is one that makes you think. After all, music is as basic as fire. The scientists were also interested in how the public reacted. Genetics was no longer only an academic discipline. It was now a part of pop culture. People weren't reading science magazines. In periodicals about rocks, they learn about DNA. It suddenly seemed true that our ancestors were still alive inside us, impacting our conduct, attitude, and even our existence. And Ozzy became the unusual messenger for that news. Nathan Pearson from Gnome said, "For a long time, we thought that Neanderthals had no descendants, but it turns out some of their DNA lives on in us. Ozzy's just happened to stand out. This means that the tale was not that Ozzy was a mutation or an aberration. His genes showed what it means to be human, a mix of old fights and new ways of doing things, a living piece of history." The message grew apparent the more they looked at his DNA data. There was nothing strange about Ozzy Osbourne's DNA. It was a mirror that showed how strong we are and how we've survived thousands of years of turbulence and change. His life, which was crazy, showed that often the most unexpected survivors have the oldest instincts: addiction, survival, and the music that runs in his family. After scientists validated the strange things in Ozzy Osbourne's genome, they started to put together the pieces of his biology and his life. For years, both fans and doctors had been wondering how he was able to stay alive after years of drug misuse, injuries, and non-stop touring. The genomic research answered certain issues, but it also made us think more deeply about how DNA, addiction, and creativity are connected. The first sign was how Ozzy's body dealt with drugs and alcohol. His specific polymorphism near the ADH4 gene made his liver make enzymes that could break down alcohol at a very high pace. This wouldn't protect him from the harmful consequences of drinking, but it could help explain why he could handle levels that would kill most people. His metabolism seemed to have learned how to run in survival mode, getting rid of poisons faster than anyone could have thought possible. Researchers also found that Ozzy's DNA has abnormalities that affect how dopamine is controlled in the brain. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter that makes people want to do things and feel good. It is also very important for addiction. People who don't manufacture enough dopamine often look for outside sources of stimulation to make up for it. People who handle it too well may always be looking for new highs to keep things exciting. Ozzy's genetic map showed that his dopamine system worked in an unusual way, which may have caused his extreme behavior and helped him be more creative with music. Nathan Pearson, one of the experts who looked at Ozzy's genome, made it easy to understand. A lot of the differences in his genome have to do with how the brain works with dopamine. That may sound technical, but in practice it meant that his brain was set up to handle high levels of stress. Every song, every show, and every risk gave him the same chemical high as taking drugs. His artistic talent and his addiction may have come from the same biological root. The genes that helped him get over his addictions may have also changed his personality in other ways. Research indicates that variants affecting dopamine and serotonin levels may lead to impulsivity, restlessness, and mood fluctuations. Those attributes made up Ozzy's public image. He was unpredictable, funny most of the time, crazy at times, but always interesting. What viewers saw on stage was more than simply a show. It was biology in action. The scientists were careful not to make big claims. They underlined that DNA alone does not determine fate. Genes, together with the environment, trauma, and personal decision, all work together to shape behavior. Still, everyone engaged was interested in the concept that his code contained some information about how he would survive. His genome tells the story of a man who was made to last. Researchers also had to deal with a new question because of the results. Is it possible that genetics can explain why certain people are good at music? Ozzy's genome did not show a music gene, but it did show differences that have to do with how the brain communicates and processes rhythm. The CLTCL1 gene variation he had changed how nerve cells deliver messages, which could impact timing and coordination. There is no scientific proof that these genes make musicians, but a lot of experts think they can improve memory, rhythm perception, and hearing sensitivity. Ozzy himself seemed to find all of this funny. He jokingly quipped that I might be an experiment in evolution. He wasn't completely wrong. His body had been through years of trauma, and his mind had been driven to its limits. But they both kept working. The sequencing experiment showed not only what made Ozzy unique, but also how the human body can change when it is pushed to its limits. Ozzy's genome became a case study in how to be strong for the scientists. For supporters, it was proof that their beloved wasn't just lucky. There was a story of survival in those twisted strands of DNA that was older than rock and roll itself. His genes didn't make up for his past or explain away his addictions, but they did highlight how biology and identity may be connected. Every cell in his body held a record of his survival, addiction, and inventiveness. That could be why Ozzy Osbourne is so hard to figure out. A guy who lived on the verge of devastation and genius, guided by instincts that were built into his DNA long before he ever sung a song. The study of living forever. As scientists learned more about Ozzy Osbourne's genome, they started to understand that they were looking at something much wider than the unusual biology of one rock star. His DNA became a guide for learning how strong people are. It seemed if his DNA held the answer to a question that medicine had been trying to answer for hundreds of years. How do some people live through something that should have killed them? The Genome team started to look at Ozzy's results next to genetic information from people who had lived very long lives or who had gotten well from serious illnesses. They saw that some of the same genetic differences showed up in both groups. These mutations typically made it harder for the body to heal cells, fight off pollutants, and control stress hormones. Ozzy's DNA had a lot of these resistance markers spread out throughout different chromosomes, like concealed armor. One finding that stood out was about genes that are linked to fixing cells and getting rid of toxins. These genes control how quickly the body gets rid of damaged cells and replaces them with healthy ones. Long-term use of drugs or alcohol usually makes the body's repair system stop working. The harm builds up until the body can't handle it anymore. But Ozzy's genetic study said that his repair systems worked better. His body cleaned up after his mess faster than it could hurt itself. When reporters asked the scientists if Ozzy's genome held the key to living forever, they chuckled, but only a little. They said that there was no such thing as a gene that made someone immortal. But what Ozzy had was probably far more interesting. A network of genetic advantages that worked together to keep him alive despite relentless biological warfare. His cells fought back more quickly. His liver worked extra hours, and his brain changed to deal with the stress. Researchers in the pharmaceutical field who looked into addiction and longevity were interested in the results. If scientists could figure out and copy the genetic features that kept Ozzy alive, they could one day be able to make novel medicines for organ damage or addiction recovery. His DNA had become a living laboratory. There was still something romantic about the discovery, even though it was based on science. Ozzy Osbourne had lived most of his life as if death were a secondary concept. And for decades, his biology backed him up. It's evident that he spent his whole life pushing past barriers that would have stopped virtually anybody else, even after he died. The Genome team finally put out a report about what they labeled adaptive genetic outliers, who are people whose biology lets them live longer than expected. Ozzy became the most well-known case. But even though experts were happy with the evidence, Ozzy himself downplayed it. He once quipped that he wasn't indestructible. "I was merely lucky with my genes." Still, his genome made people face a difficult truth about evolution. Variation has always been important for human survival. Just as some people are more likely to become addicted or depressed, some people are inherently more resistant to diseases or toxins in the environment. Ozzy's DNA proved that these features can exist in one individual at the same time, making a balance between destruction and endurance. It also made the divide between science and fate less clear. How much of our future is already written in us? Are we all carrying the plans for our own success, or worse, our own failure? Ozzy's DNA brought up these types of issues, and they stayed in people's minds long after the news stories were over. Ozzy smiled when asked years before he died what he felt about being part of genetic history. "I'm just happy I'm still here to talk about it," he responded. He was right in his own way. It was never about becoming unbeatable for him. It was about staying alive. And staying alive is what people do best. That might be why his DNA was so important. It reminded everyone that evolution is still going on. It goes on inside each of us, changing how we live, adapt, and survive. In Ozzy's instance, it sang through him, carrying on every note, scream, and unnatural heartbeat that wouldn't stop. What do you believe your own genome might be hiding about your strength or abilities? If a single man's DNA can show signs of ancient Neanderthals and explain how he survived against all odds for decades? Please leave your opinions in the comments section below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.